Okay, so let's start. So just I'm going to start with the formal introduction. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today. This is the 5th season for this IGCP648 virtual seminar. For those who don't know me, so I'm Luc Doucet, I'm your host, and today we are having Dr. Andrea Giuliani, senior scientist at the Institute for Geochemistry and Petrology in Zürich, ETH, and presenting perturbation of the deep Earth carbon cycles in response to the Cambrian Explosion. So a brief introduction. Andrea is a senior scientist at ETH, as I say, and he holds the Swiss National Science Foundation Ambition Fellowship to undertake fundamental research pertaining the composition and evolution of the deep Earth and the genesis of diamond deposits. Andrea, the audience is all yours.
Thank you, Luc, and thank you guys for attending the seminar, even though I understand that for you guys down under, at least on the Perth side, it's probably evening. So good evening, or good afternoon if you're a little bit closer to my time zone. So yeah, that's the title of my talk. So something dealing with the deep carbon cycle. We talk also have a subtitle, which is the title that I use in some other times, which is Glimpses of Earth Evolution in the deepest mantle-derived magmas. These deepest mantle-derived magmas being kimberlites, which are going to be the main subject of this story. So the seminar will have just too many co-authors to be listed over there, but you will see quite a few names popping up every now and again when I refer to some of the papers that I'm going to present in this lecture. And well, thanks to all of them, I should say. So this is a sort of very first broad introductory slide that is something most of you, or most likely all of you, are pretty familiar with. This is a nice picture of the global carbon cycle that I took from the last report of the Deep Carbon Observatory in 2019. It's a nice picture for different reasons. In this specific case, because it's well, it provides a very nice geodynamic background for this talk. On top of that, it gives us quite a good idea, a good overview of the different reservoirs of carbon that we have in different parts of the planet, say the lower mantle, the upper mantle, the atmosphere, and so on, where the size is of the reservoir in terms of carbon content is proportional to the size of the circle that you see. The blue arrows indicate fluxes through different reservoirs, and I guess the key point here is that we do have a pretty good understanding of how the global carbon cycle works today, both in terms of size and in terms of fluxes. There is still, of course, some limited understanding for some fluxes, especially say diffuse fluxes due to metamorphism, just as an example. What I've been trying to explore recently has been instead how this global carbon cycle has changed through time, and potentially find a way to try to tackle this question, and just to have some sort of initial understanding, initial quantitative understanding, or at least part of that. And I guess I could address this question because for quite a few years I've been involved in the studies of carbonate-rich magmas coming from the mantle, and specifically kimberlites. So here are just some nice pictures showing that kimberlites can contain a lot of carbonates. The white phase that you see in this picture of a kimberlite breccia, or all the interstitial colorless material that you see in this section slide. These are two different samples from two different kimberlites in South Africa and Canada. So kimberlites are quite a good candidate to try to understand a little bit how carbon works in the earth, and how has worked in the earth over time, in the deep earth over time, for different reasons, not just because they're rich in carbonates, but also because we do find them in pretty much every continent, including Antarctica. This is a new slide. This is a new figure that PHANEROZOIC has put together for a review that we are in the progress of that we are indeed preparing, where you can find kimberlites with different colors, so different circles scattered in continents around the world. The different color indicates different age. The black ones being essentially Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and the color of the backgrounds simply reflect the age of the lithosphere that the kimberlites were emplaced through. So the key points here are just that kimberlites are a global phenomenon. And secondly, if we look at the distribution of kimberlites through time, especially if now focus here on the inset on the left-hand side, we can see that the vast majority of kimberlites were actually emplaced during the Mesozoic, with a major spike during the Cretaceous. Yet we start to have kimberlites already at about 2.1 billion years, meaning we can use kimberlites to cover the second half of evolution of the Earth. Kimberlites are special, or perhaps are most well known because they're major host of diamonds. These are just this is a nice picture of a diamond, so the octahedra sticking out to the kimberlites, some nice stones. I've been lucky enough to be sitting in front of big collections of diamonds, and you know, while we might think that just the diamonds is just a piece of carbon that was very well advertised by the beers, I have to tell you that when you sitting there looking at piles of diamonds, it gives you quite a special feeling. This is myself and John Woodhead looking at the personal collection of diamonds from any different color and size and shape of the now gone John Gurney. And this is myself and Jock Roby looking at diamonds inside a diamond extraction plant in Kimberley. Anyway, going back to kimberlites, the other reason why they are particularly helpful in this business, in the business of understanding Earth evolution, is because these are probably the deepest melts extracted from the Earth mantle that we find at surface. We know that for different reasons, the perhaps easiest one to spot is that these are the only magmas that contain so-called super deep diamonds. So diamonds that occasionally reach size of something like the Lezeni Larona, 1100 carats, so something like 250 grams of diamonds, sold for something like $50 or so million. And anyway, the reason why scientifically we care about these super deep diamonds is that they occasionally contain inclusions of minerals such as ringwoodite. And if you believe some of the recent papers in Nature and Science, also calcium silica perovskites. So minerals that we know to be stable only in the mantle transition zone, if not even deeper in the case of calcium silica perovskites. That doesn't necessarily mean that kimberlites, that doesn't necessarily mean that kimberlites come all the way from the mantle transition zone. These diamonds might have been very simply transported by convection to the topmost asthenosphere and plucked to the underside of the lithosphere. But the fundamental implication for the occurrence of these super deep diamonds in kimberlites is that the melts have to derive from a minimum depth corresponding to the uppermost asthenosphere. We also know that kimberlites sample the convective mantle, for example, for petrological reasons. This is not immediate to understand, so I will try to drive you through these slides. There is a robust linear correlation between the magnesium number, so the iron magnesium ratio of magmatic olivine in kimberlites, and the iron magnesium ratio of xenocrystic olivine in kimberlites. In other words, there is a linear correlation between the composition of kimberlite melts and the composition of entrained lithospheric mantle material. You can have a direct relation between these two parameters only if the initial melt that comes from the asthenosphere interacted to a variable extent with the lithospheric mantle that is more enriched or more depleted. In other words, also just looking at the petrology, we can gather some information that kimberlites have globally similar sources in terms of major elements and compatible trace elements. And we have a paper now in JPEGs that actually shows something very similar using compatible trace elements. We also know that kimberlites sample the convective mantle because if you look at the neodymium strontium here and the hafnium neodymium isotopic systematics of kimberlites, they nicely overlap the majority, but not all of them, but yet the majority of ocean island basalts. More importantly, if we compare kimberlites, that here are the blue dots, with melts that derive from typically strongly metasomatized lithospheric mantle, subcontinental lithospheric mantles such as lamprites and orangites, orangites being carbonate-rich lamprites from cratons, we can see that the compositions is quite different. Lamprites that derive from metasomatized lithospheric mantle, they extend to very radiogenic strontium isotopes and very radiogenic neodymium isotopes, whereas kimberlites are more restricted to slightly subchondritic neodymium and hafnium isotopic composition. According to some, kimberlites might actually be related to sources that are considerably deeper than the upper asthenosphere. And this comes mostly from paleogeodynamic reconstructions and linked to very deep structures that we find in the Earth. So this is a now landmark paper that goes back to 2010 by John Torsvik, who was the first one to show that if we reconstructed the positions of kimberlites back in time, the black dots here, then we can see that for Phanerozoic kimberlites, the vast majority of them overlay the boundaries and partly also the internal regions of the African LLSVP. LLSVP meaning large low shear velocity province, so a thermochemical structure that we see occurring in the deep mantle above the core mantle boundary and extending for up to 1,000 or so kilometers above the core mantle boundary. We know that for kimberlites, the overlap is exclusively with the African one. For other magmatic expressions of mantle plumes, say ocean alum basalts, many ocean alum basalts, and most large igneous provinces, actually we can see a nice overlap with both the Pacific LLSVP and the African LLSVP. In other words, these thermochemical structures above the core mantle boundary might very well be the loci from which mantle plumes are sourced, and the fact that the majority of kimberlites overlay these structures at their time of emplacement potentially indicates that the sources of kimberlites are also located in the LLSVP, and kimberlites are therefore due to plumes sources by the margins or the internal parts of the African LLSVP, at least for the Phanerozoic. If you now go to northeastern North America, we can also find one of the few examples where kimberlites are located along an age progressive hotspot track, which then continue into the North Atlantic with formation of the New England Sea Mounts. In other words, we might here have a stationary plume on top of which the North American plate was migrating in the opposite direction, therefore was migrating northwestward. Again, these might indicate that at least locally kimberlites are related to deep plumes. Plumes that maybe, as I said before, might come all the way from the core mantle boundary, and some I have to admit circumstantial evidence for that also come from short-lived tungsten isotope, 182 tungsten isotope. So as a very brief introduction about 182 tungsten, this is a short-lived isotope that derived from the half-life derived from the decay of hafnium 182 with an half-life of just a very few million years, 9, meaning that 182 hafnium was extinct within the first 50-60 million years of Earth evolution, and any variability we see in 182 tungsten is related to a very old process. A very old process that can be something like early Earth differentiation or late accretion, for example. So in kimberlites, we measured, or actually now Nakanishi and Rich Walker measure a bunch of samples that myself, Graham Pearson and others provided, and they found a barely resolvable variation from the terrestrial standard, which is essentially indistinguishable from the upper mantle composition. This resolvable anomaly is negative and can be produced in just two ways. Either if in the source of kimberlite there was some contribution from material derived from the core, because the core is a very negative 182 tungsten isotopic composition, or some sort of remnants from early Earth differentiation that did not equilibrate with the rest of the mantle. Meaning that the source of kimberlite was partly shielded from convective homogenization with the rest of the mantle, since early after Earth formation. So this is why, this is exactly what the title says, that either the source of kimberlites was very ancient, and I've also added that or the source was very deep, something that together with this nice colorful picture gave us the cover of PNAS in one of the 2021 issues. I also tried together with Matt Jackson, Hayden Dalton, and Anders Fitzpaine to explore a little bit more in detail what is this ancient source of kimberlite and whether or not is that ancient. So what we did, essentially, we decided to compile all existing neodymium, hafnium, and strontium isotopic compositions for kimberlites through time. Here, there is an inbox showing a little sketch of how neodymium isotopes work with time. So they will always increase with age progression. So with age younging, simply because they are radiogenic isotopes. However, the slope can vary depending on whether the source is depleted. So experience, for example, partial melting, and now we're looking at the residue. So this is a steeper curve that I call the depleted product, or the slope can be lower, can be shallower if we are now looking at an enriched product, say, for example, the melt phase that was separated. So now with this knowledge in hand, we can look at time versus neodymium isotopes in kimberlite bulk rock with time, and different colors essentially indicate kimberlites from different provinces. For a province, I mean kimberlites from within a restricted region and that were in place within a restricted time frame. So the first obvious observation is that on every locality you see a spread towards towards lower values for neodymium isotopic composition, and usually we know that when there is some spread, lower neodymium isotopic value indicates some form of enrichment, being enrichment in the source, being contamination by some crustal material, being contamination by enriched lithospheric mantle material, for example. So to screen out all these effects, we decided to focus only on the most depleted isotopic composition that we find at any given time. And if you do that, then you realize that all these points, all these crosses are now nicely aligned along a very narrow lane. So say a very robust regression. And if you plot this regression and then calculate the samarium neodymium ratio corresponding to this regression, you get a value that is quite interesting, because this is exactly the same value that you get for the so-called non-chondritic Earth. Okay, so the Earth so the bulk silicate Earth is stripped from the so-called early enriched domain, perhaps due to collisional erosion or to existence of a hidden enriched reservoir, something like that. And you can play exactly the same game for hafnium isotopes, and you get a lutetium-hafnium ratio that is exactly the same as the non-chondritic Earth. So that also means that this depleted kimberlite source is more enriched than the bulk silicate Earth, but is not as is more depleted than the bulk silicate Earth, but not as depleted as the depleted mantle. So the source of morbs that we find today. So you can then play a little bit of a bold game, which is what I did, but mostly because I was comfortable with this samarium neodymium and lutetium-hafnium ratio. That is, extrapolate this regression all the way back to the age of the Earth, and what you get is that then this source intersects the composition of the chondritic uniform reservoirs, essentially the bulk silicate Earth, at an age that is within uncertainty of the formation of the Earth. In other words, if we look at these depleted kimberlite source at about 4.5 billion years, we get something that is within uncertainty of the chondritic uniform reservoir. It's a really bold move. You know, we go from 2.1 billion year to 4.5. Indeed, what I prefer to say is that this ratio is really the same ratio as the non-chondritic Earth. Meaning this depleted kimberlite source might very well derive from an early depletion of the chondritic Earth. So, you know, something that was following, for example, the magma ocean stage. But I guess the interesting question, though, is, and this is what we proposed in this paper. I guess the interesting question is that what is this source today? And to address that question, I'm now going to compare the composition of kimberlites of the depleted kimberlite sources, so the star in this chart, so the star at H0, with the composition of ocean island basalts. So we have hafnium versus neodymium, strontium versus neodymium isotopes. This is the compilation of Strachey, where I have decided to put a nice large red oval for the so-called focal zones, also called prima prevalent mantle. This is a compositional field or a mantle component, if you prefer, where essentially is drawn there because all the different ocean island basalts form trends that ultimately converge towards this common component. It's called the prima or prevalent mantle also because this is the most common composition that you find in, for example, in neodymium isotope space, if you look at the distribution of ocean island basalts, as defined 30 plus, nearly 40 years ago, actually, by Zindler Hart. Why am I focusing so much on prevalent mantle or FOSO? Well, because that is indistinguishable from the depleted kimberlite source component that we find in kimberlites through time. And this is quite an interesting observation because it implies that prima, that the prevalent mantle component, has been sampled over and over by kimberlites since at least 2.1 billion years, and therefore this prima component is not derived from early tectonic processes, from mixing between the depleted mantle components and the rich mantle component, as most folks in the oceanic basalt community think these days, but is a component that has been existing for the Earth mantle for more than 2 billion years, and potentially it is as old as the age of the Earth. So kimberlites, therefore, as I said, provide glimpses of processes that have been happening through the evolution of the Earth. And if we now switch to something more recent, they seem also to tell us something fundamental that has been happening through the Phanerozoic. So this is a paper that came out in Nature very few years ago, where we showed that kimberlites through time, most of the composition, both in terms of neodymium and hafnium isotopes, scatter broadly around the chondritic uniform reservoir, even though I just showed you that the story is a little bit different. But the fundamental, to me at least, the new observations that this paper came out with is that if we now look at kimberlites in the last 250 million years, we start to see that a lot of composition plots towards systematically much lower neodymium and hafnium isotopes compared to what we see before. And this can only happen if the source become more enriched with recycled crustal material compared to the past. So in other words, we might still have this common depleted component that has been tapped systematically through time. However, when we hit the Phanerozoic, we start to have many more kimberlites that instead also seem to tap geochemical components that are way more enriched. And the way John Woodhead decided to, and Jenna Hurt, who are the leading authors of this paper, decided to interpret this evidence is by invoking a fundamental change in mantle geodynamics occurring during the Phanerozoic, when potentially more subducting material managed to pierce through the mantle transition zones and be recycled vigorously in the deep mantle, therefore heralding a marked change to large-scale mantle mixing regimes, paraphrasing the paper. So this is a sort of big container that I forgot to mention was the first part of the talk before I actually go on and talk more about the deep carbon cycle. And here it's a sort of it's a summary slide of the new information or the new hypothesis that we have put forward during the last few years. So I showed you that the majority of kimberlites derive from sublithospheric mantle sources, that in terms of major incompatible elements, they are probably similar to each other, but not so in terms of incompatible elements, as you've seen for neodymium and hafnium isotopes, for example. These sources are potentially very deep. This is still debated. They definitely contain a common, very ancient component that we call prima. And during the Phanerozoic, these sources have been evidently perturbed, especially during the last 200, 250 million years. So with all this baggage of knowledge now, we can move on and try to use kimberlites to understand a little bit more about the deep carbon cycle and its variation through time. So in the remaining few slides, I will focus mostly on the carbon isotopes of kimberlites, and hence here there is a slide summarizing, providing some very basic background information about how carbon isotopes work. So if we look at the surface, there are two main reservoirs of carbon, oxidized carbon, say carbonate limestone, that over time consistently show a delta 13 carbon isotope carbon composition of about 0 or +1, ±2. And then we have reduced the organic carbon with composition that through time mostly range between -25 and -30 delta 13. If you now turn to the mantle and we take diamonds to be broadly representative of carbon in the mantle, we see that diamonds containing peridotitic inclusions show a unimodal distribution with a peak of -5 ±1. Eclogitic diamonds, so diamonds that contain inclusions of minerals such as omphocytic clinopyroxene or almandine-rich garnets, so potentially fragments of subducted oceanic crust. They still show main mode at -5 ±1, but they also show a very long tail towards very negative value and very few, and I stress again, very few heavy heavy carbon isotopic composition. So if you now just compare these values, what's carbon at the surface, you can see that it's actually quite common to find the recycled organic carbon stored in these diamonds, whereas you essentially nearly never find oxidized carbon, that is recycled carbonate, in these diamonds. In other words, it seems quite difficult that a lot of carbonates are recycled back in the deep earth, back in the convecting mantle, and ultimately stored in the lithosphere, which is a little bit the opposite of what people has been pushing using some stable metal isotopes in the last few years applied to mantle geochemistry. Up here, I have also included a compilation of oceanic basalts, where you can see that the main mode is not at -5 ±1, but it's shifted to something like -7. And this is due to the fact that the vast majority of carbon in these magmas was degassed. And so there is a very small fraction of carbon left in these rocks that we now can measure. And the residue of, after the gassing of carbon, after the gassing in silicate melts, has an isotopic composition that is lighter compared to the original one. Well, we know very well that CO2 has a very low solubility in silicate melts, so this result is indeed not surprisingly at all. So as I said before, kimberlites are really rich in carbonates, but carbonates occur in quite a variety of forms and shapes in kimberlites. And so the first thing that we decided to do with Mongari Castillo Oliver, a former postdoc at my time in Quarry, we decided first of all to investigate how carbon isotopes change in different textural types of carbonates to understand a little bit better what we were dealing with. So here is just a summary slide showing that we can have calcite segregation, calcite globules, we can have carbonate in the ground mass, certainly magmatic. We can also have carbonates in secondary veins that cross-cut the magmatic texture of kimberlites, and these are clearly secondary carbonates. So we went in situ, we studied carbonates in detail from a bunch of representative samples, petrography, major trace elements, strontium isotopes, carbon and oxygen isotopes by SIMS, by ion probe, in Nancy first, and then in Beijing. What we realized is that in any given sample, if we go in situ, there is quite a bit of variability in carbon isotopes, which initially was a bit daunting if you want to go globally. But then we realized that first of all, there is usually a main mode, even though it's not very well pronounced, and especially, and that's the trick here, if you now compare the average composition of magmatic carbonates, so say ground mass carbonates, magmatic segregations, with bulk carbon isotopic composition of carbonates, we actually get that usually we have a pretty good one-to-one relationship with, you know, a couple of outliers, I have to say, but generally we see that the average of in situ analysis of magmatic carbonates is the same as the bulk sample for delta 13 carbon. In other words, we don't necessarily need to go in situ and you know, do painstaking work to pick out magmatic carbonates and then measure them and find areas that are large enough for ion probe, but we can just go globally and take a bulk kimberlite samples and measure their carbon isotopic composition to get something that is representative of the magmatic source, or at least of the melt carbon isotopic composition. So armed with this knowledge, we indeed decided to go globally. We target something like 150 or so samples from kimberlites globally. In addition of that, we reviewed all the existing data to make sure we could actually fill in all the gaps and have a global coverage. We only restricted this survey to intrusive kimberlites, so hypoabyssal subvolcanic kimberlites, to avoid the effect of the gassing that would affect volcaniclastic kimberlites. And we made sure to try to cover, you know, as many localities and as many continents as possible, from Australia to India to all the way to Canada and Brazil. And this is how the data look like in terms of carbon isotopes versus time compared to the typical mantle values, which are here represented by the green band. Each symbol is the average of at least 3 analyses from at least 2 different samples to make sure that we were not picking outliers. And the bars here are simply 2 standard deviation of the mean. So what you can see is that essentially from 2.1 billion years all the way to something like 300 or so million years, except for 2 outliers, kimberlites have always been sampling a very normal mantle in terms of carbon isotopic composition. Okay, there's nothing special happening. If you now switch your attention to what's happening during the last 250 million years, you can see that there is a clear evidence of perturbation. Perturbation with a third of the analyzed localities that show carbon isotopic composition that is resolvably lower than typical mantle values. And this is already reminiscent of what I showed you before for neodymium and hafnium isotopic composition in bulk kimberlite rocks, where I was talking about Phanerozoic perturbation due to more and geochemically enriched composition. I can show you the same story now using strontium isotopes in kimberlites. This time we're not using bulk rocks because strontium is quite susceptible to alteration and crustal contamination in bulk kimberlite rocks. These are only values for perovskite, so a small but robust and magmatic minerals that you find in kimberlites. Now keep in mind, and this sketch tells you that for strontium isotopes, the radiogenic isotope system works the opposite way around than neodymium and hafnium. Now, if you have higher strontium isotopic composition at any given time, that usually reflects a form of enrichment. So recycling of crustal material in your source, for example, whereas if compositions are lower, that's depletion. And what we see here is that over the last 150 million years, we have quite a few kimberlites that start to show strontium isotopic composition that are significantly higher than what we see in the past, which is indeed an indication of geochemical perturbation, or if you prefer, of more widespread pollution of the source of kimberlites by deeply subducted crustal material, or the laminated crustal material, if you prefer. So if we now try to compare carbon isotopes with the strontium isotopes, perovskite again, or carbon isotopes with the hafnium isotope bulk rock kimberlites this time, we can find in both cases two not particularly robust, but still statistically meaningful correlations. So where progressively lower carbon isotopic compositions are here associated with progressively higher strontium isotopic compositions, and with progressively lower hafnium isotopic composition. So I guess the only or the most straightforward way to explain this data is by progressively polluting similar normal prima-like convecting mantle sources with more and more recycled crustal material that contain some form of organic carbon containing some form of organic carbon with low delta 13 carbon isotopic composition. I also tried to quantitatively model this process, and these two red curves are indeed mixing curves between a prima-like convective mantle source and a subducting gloss-like sedimentary component containing some organic carbon, with the gray dots being the results of Monte Carlo simulation. And you can see that the majority of kimberlites can be reproduced by essentially adding up to 10 or so % of hafnium and carbon from the recycled component in the convecting mantle source. So importantly, these two trends cannot be explained by the gassing. So the gassing could potentially lower the carbon isotopic composition of kimberlites, no problem there, but it would not modify the strontium or hafnium isotopic composition of these rocks. So I guess, in other words, it looks like we do have a clear evidence of a phanerozoic perturbation in the deep carbon cycle, evidenced by the carbon isotopic composition of kimberlites, but we don't yet have the actual actors that played a role in this plot. And here I'm therefore switching to something that to some plots that are potentially are at least on a first view not necessarily related to each other. So now time is only restricted to the last 1 billion years. Up here we have again carbon isotopes in kimberlites. These are the pre 250 million years kimberlite. These are the post 250 million years kimberlites. This is the frequency of kimberlite events, something like what I showed you in one of the very first slides. And you can see at 250 million years, the so-called kimberlite bloom. This is when we start to have way more kimberlite eruptions than what we could see before. And perhaps coincidentally, this indeed coincides with the perturbation in the carbon isotopic composition of the kimberlite source. Down here, instead, there is something that, as I said, might look completely unrelated. This is the total organic carbon in shales through time. And you can see that these values become manifold higher compared to earlier on after the Cambrian explosion. Most likely because due to the increase in primary productivity in seawater, we have an additional delivery of organic carbon towards the sea bottom, and therefore an increase in total organic carbon that we find in marine sediments and shales. And hence the Cambrian explosion over there. Then I also plotted the cold subduction somewhere at 8 or so 100 million years, when we start to see a colder subduction regime, and therefore sedimentary components and in general subducting components could be, say, more easily transported into the deep earth. We have a deeper slab break-off, and this is something that is, for example, Richard Stern attributed as the cause of an increase in the frequency of kimberlite eruption through time. However, it's clear that there is something like 5 or so 100 million years of time gap between colder subduction regimes and the kimberlite bloom, so it doesn't look like this can be a direct trigger. You can also see that, and this is where I'm going, that there is something like 3 or so 100 million years between the Cambrian explosion and the perturbation in the carbon isotopic composition of kimberlites. So there must be something else. We cannot really just explain this change in carbon isotopic composition of the deep source of kimberlites with additional transport, additional subduction of organic carbon in shales following the Cambrian explosion. We need something else. And I think that's where geodynamics comes handy. We know that it takes something like 150 or so million years for subducted plates to travel all the way to the core mantle boundary. 150 to 200 or so million years, we know that the material has to travel for another 50 or so million years, at least along the core mantle boundary, before it can be entrained by mantle plumes, a process that then takes another 20 or so million years to transport material to the upper asthenosphere, where it can undergo partial melting. So the entire cycle takes at least 200 to 300 million years. And that's indeed that sort of time gap that we see between the Cambrian explosion, between increasing export of organic carbon to the sea bottom, increasing potentially subduction of organic carbon with low delta 13 in the mantle, and the perturbation in the carbon isotopic composition of the kimberlite source, and the increase in frequency of kimberlite eruptions that is perhaps linked to this increased transport of organic carbon into to the deep earth. In other words, and that's I guess that's the story that we proposed. The perturbation that we see at the Earth's surface, triggered by the Cambrian explosion, might indeed have caused a fundamental change also in the deep carbon cycle, due to an increased amount of organic carbon. It is not just transported to the sea bottom, as we see in shales, but also subducted to the convective mantle. And I was stuck for a moment. I hope you guys didn't lose me too. So this is my summary slides. So what the data clearly show is that radiogenic isotopes as well as carbon isotopes in kimberlites through time show clear evidence of a perturbation in the second half of the Phanerozoic. I've tried to link these perturbation, at least for carbon isotopes, to a change in subduction regimes with allowed deeper and more effective recycling of subducted crusty material, as well as an increase in marine primary productivity following the Cambrian explosion, and therefore increased input of organic carbon in the mantle. In other words, I've been trying to show that the changes in biogeochemical processes that we see at the surface also as a spectacle in the deep earth, and especially in the regions of the deep earth that then are affected by partial melting and formation of magma such as kimberlites. So in terms of outlook, we definitely need more robust tracers and less equivocal to understand whether or not kimberlites are really related to to very deep mantle sources, so very deep plumes, and I'm talking about noble gases or short-lived isotopes, especially 142 neodymium. We need to better track the distribution of prima through time. We now know through not yet published work that it's not common just in kimberlites, but it's common in a variety of magmas, of intracontinental magmas. And so that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to better understand its distribution and its origin by combining statistical geochemistry and geodynamic models. And ultimately, we need to better understand what is the feedback between processes occurring at the surface, say changes in plate tectonic regimes, changes in biogeochemical processes, and the deep earth, by using a variety of new and existing tools, and of course moving way beyond kimberlites, but exploring the record of mantle-derived magmatism through time. And with that, guys, I thank you for the attention.